This is your government video on the First Amendment's right to freedom of the press and assembly. So, the freedom of the press is in the First Amendment, and it says the freedom of the press shall not be infringed. Now, this doesn't mean that media corporations can just print whatever they want, because there are obviously limits. If they were to print lies about people, as an example, then you have libel or slander, assuming that they knew it was false and they were purposely doing it in order to harm somebody. That would be illegal. One of the cases that we learned about was the New York Times versus the United States. And this is the case about the Pentagon Papers. Every time a media organization is trying to print information about the government, um, there is a balancing act that has to happen between weighing the right of a free press to tell us information. And remember, the press has a job duty to check and balance our government for us versus the national security of the country. So, in the New York Times case, does publishing these Pentagon Papers, which are classified military documents, does that harm national security? Or is that a press organization trying to inform us about maybe bad decisions our government made? So, it's always about government transparency versus our safety and security. And again, it's not always one or the other. They have to try to weigh which things are more important at the time. And in the New York Times case, they determined that the New York Times could publish them and that the transparency of the government and their people to know what their government was doing was more important. Ultimately, freedom of the press comes down to prior restraint. And prior restraint is whether the government can force a media company to not publish something at all. Now, normally we can publish something and then you and I have our opinions about it and we can talk about it, and that's freedom of speech. And we also have the right to criticize governments and political parties and candidates. But if the government can go in and tell a media organization, you can't publish this at all, then we will never know about it. And so the Supreme Court really does not like to use prior restraint. That's pretty heavy-handed censorship. And remember, prior restraint then is only determined by the government. The government determines if that thing is too harmful to national security. And without the Supreme Court and without the courts to check and balance that, we would never know what the government's doing if it was maybe harmful. So the Supreme Court enhances freedom of the press a lot. They like the freedom of the press. They like a free and independent media to check and balance the government if they're doing something wrong. But in most cases, it has to be a pretty serious national security concern for them to completely restrain something before it's been published. There are some other types of requirements on the freedom of assembly. So you have the right, obviously, to assemble with like-minded people, to protest peacefully, that is. The government can also place what's called time, place, and manner restrictions on protests. So you don't have the right to protest anywhere you want at any time. You can't go on somebody's private property and stage a protest. You can't block off streets in a protest. So the government, including local police, have the right to try to secure a protest, and they have to secure the people in the protest and the counter protesters. So if you remember the protests in Charlottesville, Virginia, a couple years back, there were obviously some people who were protesting the removing of monuments, Civil War monuments that some people thought were discriminatory and harkening back to old times in the Civil War. Well, you have to apply for a permit, and that permit and make sure that the local police know what time you're going to do this at, what places are you legally allowed to protest, and some other types of safety restrictions, including blocking off places for counter protesters. And that is lawful. They can't tell you can never protest, so they can't just ban your application completely, but they can say, hey, maybe this date or time or this place is not the best for you. Let's move you to a different time or place. And that's probably one of the things that failed in the Charlottesville, Virginia protests. The local police officers really did not secure either the protesters or the opposing protesters very well. So they can make restrictions for safety of anybody in that general vicinity. But that's it.